Voices Beyond Pages. This is The Fall of Gondolin by J.R.R. Tolkien.
Tuor stood then in the way of that beast, but was sundered from Egalmoth, and they pressed him backward even to the centre of the square nigh the fountain. There he became weary from the strangling heat, and was beaten down by a great demon, even Gothmog, lord of Balrogs, son of Melkor. Below, Ecthelion, whose face was of the pallor of grey steel, and whose shield arm hung limp at his side, strode above him as he fell, and that gnome drove at the demon, yet did not give him his death, getting rather a wound to his sword arm than his weapon left his grasp. Then leapt Ecthelion, lord of the fountain, fairest of the Noldoli, full at Gothmog, even as he raised his whip, and his helm, that had a spike upon it, he drove into that evil breast, and he twined his legs about his foeman's thighs, and the Balrog yelled, and fell forward. But those two dropped into the basin of the king's fountain, which was very deep. There found that creature his bane, and Ecthelion sank steel-laden into the depths, and so perished the lord of the fountain after fiery battle in cool waters. Now Tuor had arisen when the assault of Ecthelion gave him space, and seeing that great deed he wept for his love of that fair gnome of the fountain. But being wrapped in battle, he scarce cut his way to the folk about the palace. There, seeing the wavering of the enemy by reason of the dread of the fall of Gothmog, the marshal of the host, the royal house laid on, and the king came down in splendour among them, and hewed with them, that they swept again much of the square, and of the Balrogs slew even 20, which is a very great prowess indeed, but greater still did they do, for they hemmed in one of the fire drakes for all his flaming, and forced him into the very waters of the fountain that he perished therein. Now this was the end of that fair water, and its pools turned to steam, and its spring was dried up, and it shot no more into the heaven, but rather a vast column of vapour rose to the sky, and the cloud therefrom floated over all the land. Then dread fell on all for the doom of the fountain, and the square was filled with mists of scalding heat and blinding fogs, and the people of the royal house were killed therein by heat, and by the foe, and by the serpents, and by one another. But a body of them saved the king, and there was a rally of men beneath Glingol and Bansil. Then the king said, "Great is the fall of Gondolin," and men shuddered, for such were the words of Amnon the prophet of old. But Tuor, speaking wildly for ruth and love of the king, cried, "Gondolin still stands yet, and Ulmo will not suffer it to perish." Now they were at the time standing, Tuor by the trees, and the king upon the stairs, as they had stood aforetime when Tuor spoke the embassy of Ulmo. But Tuorgon said, "Evil have I brought upon the flower of the plain in despite of Ulmo, and now he leaveth it to wither in the fire. Lo, hope is no more in my heart for my city of loveliness, but the children of the Noldoli shall not be worsted forever." Then did the Gondothlim clash their weapons, for many stood nigh. But Tuorgon said, "Fight not against doom, O my children. Seek ye who may safety in flight, if perhaps there be yet time. But let Tuor have your lealty." But Tuor said, "Thou art king." And Tuorgon might answer, "Yet no blow will I strike more." And he cast his crown at the roots of Glingol. Then did Galdor, who stood there, pick it up. But Tuorgon accepted it not, and bare of head he climbed to the topmost pinnacle of that white tower that stood nigh to his palace. There he shouted in a voice like a horn blown among the mountains, and all that were gathered there beneath the trees, and the foemen in the midst of the square heard him. Great is the victory of the Noldoli! And it is said that it was then middle night, and that the orcs yelled in derision. Then did men speak of a sally, and were of two minds. Many held that it was impossible to burst through, nor might they even so get over the plain or through the hills, and that it were better therefore to die about the king. But Tuor might not think well of the death of so many fair women and children, were it at the hands of their own folk in the last resort, or by the weapons of the enemy. And he spoke of the delving and of the secret way. Therefore did he counsel that they beg Torgon to have other mind, and coming among them led that remnant southward to the walls, and the entry of that passage. But he himself burnt with desire to fare thither, and know how Idril and Erendel might be, or to get tidings hence to them, and bid them be gone speedily, for Gondolin was taken. Now Tuor's plan seemed to the lords desperate indeed, seeing the narrowness of the tunnel, and the greatness of the company that must pass it. Yet would they fain take this rede in their straits. But Tuorgon hearkened not, and bid them fare now ere it was too late. And let Tuor, said he, be your guide and your chieftain, but I, Tuorgon, will not leave my city, and will burn with it. Then sped they messengers again to the tower, saying, Sire, who are the Gondothlim if thou perish? Lead us. But he said, Lo, I abide here. And a third time, and he said, If I am king, obey my behests, and dare not to parley further with my commands. After that they sent no more, and made ready for the forlorn attempt. But the folk of the royal house that yet lived would not budge a foot, but gathered thickly about the base of the king's tower. We will stay if Torgon goes not forth. And they might not be persuaded. Now was Tuor torn sorely between his reverence for the king and the love for Idril and his child, wherewith his heart was sick. Yet already serpents fare about the square, trampling upon dead and dying, and the foe gathers in the midst for the last onslaught. And the choice must be made. Then, because of the wailing of the women in the halls of the palace, and the greatness of his pity for that sad remainder of the peoples of Gondolin, he gathered all that ruthful company, maids, children, and mothers, and setting them amidst most, marshalled as well as he might his men around them. Deepest he set them at flank and at rear, for he purposed falling back southward, fighting as best he might with the rear guard as he went. Thus, if it might so be, to win down the road of Pomps to the place of the gods, ere any great force be sent to circumvent him. Thence was it his thought to go by the way of running waters, past the fountains of the south, to the walls and to his home. But the passage of the secret tunnel he doubted much. Thereupon, espying his movement, the foe made forthwith a great onslaught upon his left flank and upon his rear, from east and the north. Even as he began to withdraw, but his right was covered by the king's hall, and the head of that column drew already into the road of Pomps. Then some hugest of the drakes came on and glared in the fog, and he must perforce bid the company to go at a run, fighting on the left at haphazard. But Glorfindel held the rear manfully, and many more of the golden flower fell there. So it was that they passed the road of Pomps, and reached Gar Anion, the place of the gods, and this was very open, and in its middle the highest ground of all the city. Here Tuor looks for an evil stand, and it is scarce in his hope to get much further. But behold, the foe seems already to slacken, and scarce any follow them, and this is a wonder. Now comes Tuor at their head to the place of wedding, and lo, there stands Idril before him with her hair unbraided, as on that day of their marriage before, and great is his amazement. By her stood Voronwe, and none other, but Idril saw not even Tuor, for her gaze was set back upon the place of the king that now lay somewhat below them. Then all that host halted, and looked back whither her eyes gazed, and their hearts stood still, for now they saw why the foe pressed them so little, and the reason of their salvation. Lo, a drake was coiled even on the very steps of the palace, and defiled their whiteness, but swarms of orcs ransacked therein, and dragged forth forgotten women and children, or slew men that fought alone. Glingol was withered to the stock, and Bansil was utterly blackened, and the king's tower was beset. High up they could descry the form of the king, but about the base a serpent of iron, spouting flame, lashed and rode with its tail, and balrogs were round him. And there was the king's house in great anguish, and dread cries carried up to the watchers. So was it that the sack of the halls of Torgon and that most valiant stand of the royal house held the mind of the foe, so that Tuor got thence with his company and stood now in tears upon the place of the gods. Then said Idril, Woe is me whose father waiteth doom even upon his topmost pinnacle, but 7 times woe whose lord hath gone down before Melko, and will stride home no more. For she was distraught with the agony of that night. Then said Tuor, Lo, Idril, it is I, and I live. Yet now will I get thy father hence, be it from the hells of Melko. With that he would make down the hill alone, maddened by the grief of his wife. But she, coming to her wits in a storm of weeping, clasped his knee, saying, my lord, and delayed him. Yet even as they spoke, a great noise and a yelling rose from that place of anguish. Behold, the tower leapt into a flame, and in a stab of fire it fell, for the dragons crushed the base of it and all who stood there. Great was the clangour of that terrible fall, and therein passed Torgon, king of the Gondothlim, and for that hour the victory was to Melkor. Then said Idril heavily, Sad is the blindness of the wise. But Tuor said, Sad too is the stubbornness of those we love, yet it was a valiant fault. Then stooping, he lifted and kissed her, for she was more to him than all the Gondothlim, but she wept bitterly for her father. Then turned Tuor to the captain, saying, Lo, we must get hence with all speed, lest we be surrounded. And forthwith they moved onward, as swiftly as they might, and got them far from thence, ere the orcs tired of sacking the palace and rejoicing at the fall of the tower of Torgon. Now are they in the southward city, and meet but scattered bands of plunderers, who fly before them, yet do they find fire and burning everywhere for the ruthlessness of that enemy. Women do they meet, some with babes, and some laden with chattels, but Tuor would not let them bear away, aught save a little food. Coming now at length to a greater quiet, Tuor asked Voronway for tidings, in that Idril spoke not and was well nigh in a swoon. And Voronway told him of how she and he had waited before the doors of the house while the noise of those battles grew and shook their hearts, and Idril wept for lack of tidings from Tuor. At length she had sped the most part of her guard down the secret way with Erendel, constraining them to depart with imperious words. Yet was her grief great at that sundering. She herself would bide, said she, nor seek to live after her lord, and then she fared about gathering womenfolk and wanderers, and speeding them down the tunnel, and smiting marauders with her small band, nor might they dissuade her from bearing a sword. At length they had fallen in with a band somewhat too numerous, and Voronway had dragged her thence, but by the luck of the gods, for all else but them perished, and their foe burned Tuor's house, yet found not the secret way. Therewith, said Voronway, thy lady became distraught of weariness and grief, and fared into the city wildly to my great fear, nor might I get her to sally from the burning. About the saying of these words were they come to the southern walls, and nigh to Tuor's house, and lo, it was cast down, and the wreckage was a smoke, and thereat was Tuor bitterly wroth. But there was a noise that boded the approach of orcs, and Tuor dispatched that company as swiftly as might be down that sacred way. Now is there great sorrow upon that staircase as those exiles bid farewell to Gondolin, yet are they without much hope of a further life beyond the hills, for how shall any slip from the hand of Melkor? Glad is Tuor when all have passed the entrance, and his fear lightens. Indeed, by the luck of the Valar only can all the folk have got therein unspied of the orcs. Some now are left, who, casting aside their arms, labour with picks from within, and block up the entry of the passage. Faring then after the host as they might, but when that folk had descended the stairway to a level with the valley, the heat grew to a torment for the fire of the dragons that were about the city. And they were indeed nigh, for the delving there was at no great depth in the earth. Boulders were loosened by the tremors of the ground, and falling crushed many, and fumes were in the air so that their torches and lanterns went out. Here they fell over bodies of some that had gone before and perished, And Tuor was in fear for Erindel, and they pressed on in great darkness and anguish. Nigh 2 hours were they in that tunnel of the earth, and toward its end it was scarce finished, but rugged at the sides and low. Then came they at the last, lessened by well nigh a tithe, to the tunnel's opening, and it debouched cunningly in a large basin where once water had lain, but it was now full of thick bushes. Here were gathered no small press of mingled folk, whom Idril and Voronway had sped down the hidden way before them, and they were weeping softly in weariness and sorrow, but Erendel was not there. Thereat were Tuor and Idril in anguish of heart. Lamentation was there too among all those others, for amidmost of the plain about them loomed afar the hill of Amon Gwareth, crowned with flames, where it stood, the gleaming city of their home. Fire drakes are about it, and monsters of iron fare in and out of its gates, and great as that sack of the Balrogs and Orcs. Somewhat of comfort has this none the less for the leaders, for they judge the plain to be nigh empty of Melkor's folk, save hard by the city, for thither have fed all his evil ones to revel in that destruction. Now, therefore said Galdor, we must get as far hence towards the encircling mountains as may ere dawn come upon us, and that giveth no great space of time, for summer is at hand. Thereat rose a dissension, for a number said that it were folly to make for Cristorn, as Tuor proposed. The sun, say they, will be up long ere we win the foothills, and we shall be whelmed in the plain by those drakes and those demons. Let us bid fair to Bad Uthwen, the way of escape, for that is but half the journeying, and our weary and our wounded may hope to win so far if no further. Yet Idril spoke against this, and persuaded the lords that they trust not to the magic of that way that had aforetime shielded it from discovery. For what magic stands if Gondolin be fallen? None the less, a large body of men and women sundered from Tuor and fared to Bad Uthwen, and there into the jaws of a monster who by the guile of Melkor at Maeglin's reed sat at the outer issue that none came through. But the others, led by Legolas Greenleaf of the House of the Tree, who knew all that plain by day or by dark, and was night-sighted, made much speed over the vale for all their weariness, and halted only after a great march. Then was all the earth spread with the grey light of that sad dawn which looked no more on the beauty of Gondolin, but the plain was full of mists, and that was a marvel, for no mist or fog came there ever before, and this perchance had to do with the doom of the Fountain of the King. Again they rose, and covered by the vapours, fared long past dawn in safety, till they were already too far away for any to descry them in those misty airs, from the hill or from the ruined walls. Now the mountains, or rather their lowest hills, were on that side 7 leagues save a mile from Gondolin, and Cristorn the Cleft of Eagles 2 leagues of upward going from the beginning of the mountains, for it was at a great height, wherefore they had yet 2 leagues, and part of a third to traverse amid the spurs and the foothills, and they were very weary. By now the sun hung well above his saddle in the eastern hills, and she was very red and great, and the mists nigh them were lifted, but the ruins of Gondolin were utterly hidden as in a cloud. Behold then at the clearing of the air as they saw, but a few furlongs off, a knot of men that fled on foot, and these were pursued by a strange cavalry, for on great wolves rode orcs, as they thought, brandishing spears. Then said Tuor, Lo, there is Erindel, my son. Behold, his face shineth as a star in the waste, and my men of the wing are about him, and they are in sore straits. Forthwith he chose 50 of the men that were least wary, and leaving the main company to follow, he fared over the plain with that troop as swiftly as they had strength left. Coming now to carry a voice, Tuor shouted to the men about Elendil to stand and flee not, for the wolf riders were scattering them and slaying them piecemeal, and the child was upon the shoulders of one Hendor, a housecarl of Idril's, and he seemed like to be left with his burden. Then they stood back to back, and Hendor and Erendel amidmost, but Tuor soon came up, though all his troops were breathless. Of all the wolf riders there were a score, and of the men that were about Erendel but 6 living. Therefore had Tuor opened his men to a crescent of but 1 rank, and hoped so to envelop the riders, lest any escaping bring tidings to the main foe, and draw ruin upon the exiles. In this he succeeded, so that only 2 escaped, and therewithal wounded, and without their beasts. Wherefore were the tidings brought too late to the city. Glad was Erindel to greet Tuor, and Tuor most fain of his child. But said Erindel, I am thirsty, father, for I have run far, nor had Hendor need to bear me. Thereto his father said naught, having no water, and thinking of the need of all that company that he guided. But Erindel said again, It was good to see Maitland die so, for he would set arms about my mother, and I liked him not. But I would travel in no tunnels for all Melkov's wolf riders. Then Tuor smiled and set him upon his shoulders. Soon after this the main company came up, and Tuor gave Erindel to his mother, who was in great joy. But Erindel would not be borne in her arms, for he said, Mother Idril, thou art weary, and warriors in mail ride not among the Gondothlim, save it be old Salgon. And his mother laughed amid her sorrow, but Erindel said, Nay, where is Salgon? For Salgon had told him quaint tales, or played drolleries with him at times, and Erindel had much laughter of the old gnome in those days when he came many a day to the house of Tuor, loving the good wine, and fair repast he there received. But none could say where Salgon was, nor can they now. Mayhap he was whelmed by fire upon his bed, yet some have it that he was taken captive to the halls of Melko, and made his buffoon. And this is an ill fate for a noble of the good race of the gnomes. Then was Erindel sad at that, and walked beside his mother in silence. Now came they to the foothills, and it was full morning, but still grey, and there nigh to the beginning of the upward road folk stretched them, and rested in a little dale fringed with trees and with hazel bushes, and many slept despite their peril, for they were utterly spent. Yet Tuor set a strict watch, and himself slept not. Here they made one meal of scanty food and broken meats, and Erindel quenched his thirst and played beside a little brook. Then said he to his mother, Mother Idril, I would we had good Ecthelion of the fountain here to play with me on his flute, or make me willow whistles. Perchance he is gone on ahead. But Idril said nay, and told what she had heard of his end. Then said Erindel that he cared not ever to see the streets of Gondolin again, and he wept bitterly. But Tuor said that he would not again see those streets, for Gondolin is no more. Thereafter nigh to the hour of sundown behind the hills, Tuor bid the company rise, and they pressed on by rugged paths. Soon now the grass faded, and gave way to mossy stones, and trees fell away, and even the pines and firs grew sparse. About the set of the sun, the way so wound behind a shoulder of the hills that they might not again look towards Gondolin. There all that company turned, and lo! The plain is clear and smiling in the last light as of old, but afar off, as they gazed, a great flare shot up against the darkened north, and that was the fall of the last tower of Gondolin, even that which had stood hard by the southern gates, and whose shadow fell oft across the walls of Tuor's house. Then sank the sun, and they saw Gondolin no more. Now the pass of Cristorn, that is the Eagle's Cleft, is one of dangerous going, and that host had not ventured it by dark, lanternless and without torches, and very weary and cumbered with women and children, and sick and stricken men, had it not been for their great fear of Melko's scouts, for it was a great company, and might not fare very secretly. Darkness gathered rapidly as they approached that high place, and they must string out into a long and straggling line. Galdor and a band of spearmen armed went ahead, and Legolas was with them, whose eyes were like cats for the dark, yet could they see further. Thereafter followed the least wary of the women supporting the sick and the wounded that could go on foot. Idril was with these, and Erindel, who bore up well, but Tuor was in the midmost behind them with all his men of the wing, and they bare some who were grievously hurt, and Igalmold was with him, but he had got a hurt in that sally from the square. Behind again came many women with babes and girls, and lamed men, yet was the going slow enough for them. At the rearmost went to the largest band of men Battle Hall, and there was Glorfindel of the golden hair. Thus were they come to Cristorn, which is an ill place by reason of its height, for this is so great that spring nor summer come ever there, and it is very cold. Indeed, While the valley dances in the sun, there all the year snow dwells in those bleak places, and even as they came there, the wind howled, coming from the north behind them, and it bit sorely. Snow fell and whirled in wind eddies, and got into their eyes, and this was not good, for there the path is narrow, and of the right or westerly hand a sheer wall rises nigh 7 chains from the way, ere it bursts atop into jagged pinnacles where are many eyries. There dwells Thorondor, king of eagles, lord of the Thornhold, whom the Eldar named Sorontor. But of the other hand is a fall not right sheer, yet dreadly steep, and it has long teeth of rock up-pointing, so that one may climb down, or fall perhaps, but by no means up. And from that deep is no escape at either end, any more than by the sides, and Thornseer runs at bottom. He falls therein from the south, over a great precipice, but with a slender water. For he is a thin stream in those heights, and he issues to the north after flowing but a rocky mile above ground down a narrow passage that goes into the mountain, and scarce a fish could squeeze through with him. Galdor and his men were come now to the end nigh to where Thornseer falls into the abyss, and the others straggled for all Tuor's efforts, back over most of the mile of the perilous way between chasm and cliff, so that Glorfindel's folk were scarce come to its beginning, when there was a yell in that night that echoed in that grim region. Behold, Galdor's men were beset in the dark suddenly by shapes leaping from behind rocks, where they had lain hidden even from the glance of Legolas. It was Tuor's thought they had fallen in with one of Melkor's ranging companies, and he feared no more than a sharp brush in the dark. Yet he sent the women and sick around him rearward, and joined his men to Galdor's, and there was an affray upon the perilous path. But now rocks fell from above, and things looked ill, for they did grievous hurt. But matters seemed to Tuor yet worse, when the noise of arms came from the rear, and tidings were said to him by a man of the Swallow that Glorfindel was ill bested by men from behind, and that a Balrog was with them. Then was he sore afraid of a trap, and this was even what had in truth befallen, for watchers had been set by Melko all about the encircling hills. Yet so many did the valour of the Gondothlim draw off to the assault ere the city could be taken, that these were but thinly spread, and were at the least here in the south. None the less, one of these had espied the company as they started the upward, going from the Dale of Hazels, and as many bands were got together against them as might be, and devised to fall upon the exiles to front and rear, even upon the perilous way of Cristorn. Now Galdor and Glorfindel held their own despite the surprise of the assault, and many of the orcs were struck into the abyss, but the falling of the rocks was like to end all their valour, and the flight from Gondolin to come to ruin. The moon about that hour rose above the pass, and the gloom somewhat lifted, for his pale light filtered into dark places, yet it lit not the path for the height of the walls. Then arose Thorondor, king of eagles, and he loved not Melko. For Melko had caught many of his kindred, and chained them against sharp rocks, to squeeze from them the magic words whereby he might learn to fly, for he dreamt of contending even against Manwë in the air. And when they would not tell, he cut off their wings, and sought to fashion therefrom a mighty pair for his own use, but it availed not. Now when the clamour from the pass rose to his great eyrie, he said, "Wherefore are those foul things, those orcs on the hills, climbed nigh to my throne? And why do the sons of the Noldoli cry out in the low places, for fear of the children of Melko the Accursed? Arise, O Thornhold, whose beaks are of steel, and whose talons are swords." Thereupon there was a rushing like a great wind in rocky places, and the Thornhold, the people of the eagles, fell on those orcs who had scaled above the path, and tore their faces and their hands, and flung them to the rocks of Thornseer far below. Then were the Gondothlim glad, and they made in after days the eagle a sign of their kindred in token of their joy, and Idril bore it, but Erendel loved rather the swan wing of his father. Now unhampered, Galdor's men bore back those that opposed them, for they were not very many, and the onset of the Thornolf affrighted them much, and the company fared forward again, though Glorfindel had fighting enough in the rear. Already the half had passed the perilous way in the falls of Thorinseer, when that Balrog that was with the rearward foe leapt with great might on certain lofty rocks that stood into the path on the left side upon the lip of the chasm, and thence with a leap of fury he was past Glorfindel's men, and among the women and the sick in front, lashing with his whip of flame. Then Glorfindel leapt forward upon him, and his golden armour gleamed strangely in the moon, and he hewed at that demon that it leapt again upon a great boulder, and Glorfindel after. Now there was a deadly combat upon that high rock above the folk, and these, pressed behind and hindered ahead, were grown so close that well nigh all could see, yet was it over ere Glorfindel's men could leap to his side. The ardour of Glorfindel drove that Balrog from point to point, and his mail fended him from its whip and claw. Now had he beaten a heavy swinge upon its iron helm, now hewn off the creature's whip arm at the elbow. Then sprang the Balrog in the torment of his pain, and fear full at Glorfindel, who stabbed like a dart of a snake, but he found only a shoulder and was grappled, and they swayed to a fall upon the crag top. Then Glorfindel's left hand sought a dirk, and this he thrust up that it pierced the Balrog's belly, nigh his own face. For that demon was double his stature, and it shrieked and fell backward from the rock, and falling clutched Glorfindel's yellow locks beneath his cap, and those twain fell into the abyss. Now this was a very grievous thing, for Glorfindel was most dearly beloved, and lo, the dint of their fall echoed about the hills, and the abyss of Thorinseer rang. Then at the death cry of the Balrog the orcs before and behind wavered and were slain or fled far away, and Thorondor himself, a mighty bird, descended to the abyss and brought up the body of Glorfindel, but the Balrog lay, and the water of Thorinseer ran black for many a day far below in Tumladen. Still do the Eldar say, when they see good fighting, at great odds of power against a fury of evil, Alas! It is Glorfindel and the Balrog, and their hearts are still sore for that fair one of the Noldoli. Because of their love, despite the haste and their fear of the advent of new foes, Tuor let raise a great stone cairn over Glorfindel just there beyond the perilous way, by the precipice of Eagle Stream, and Thorondor has let not any harm come thereto. But yellow flowers have fared thither, and blow ever now about that mound, in those unkindly places, but the folk of the golden flower wept at its building, and might not dry their tears. Now who shall tell of the wanderings of Tuor and the exiles of Gondolin, in the wastes that lie beyond the mountains to the south of the vale of Tumladen? Miseries were theirs, and death, colds and hungers, and ceaseless watches, that they won ever through those regions infested by Melkor's evil, came the great slaughter and damage done to his power in that assault, and from the speed and wariness with which Tuor led them, for of a certain Melkor knew of that escape, and was furious thereat. Ulmo had heard tidings in the far oceans of the deeds that were done, but he could not yet aid them, for they were far from waters and rivers, and indeed they thirsted sorely, and they knew not the way. But after a year and more of wandering, in which many a time they journeyed, long tangled in the magic of those wastes, only to come again upon their own tracks, once more the summer came, and nigh to its height they came at last upon a stream, and following this they came to better lands, and were a little comforted. Here did Voronwë guide them, for he had caught a whisper of Ulmo's in that stream one late summer's night, and he got ever much wisdom from the sound of waters. Now he led them even till they came down to Sirion, whence that stream fed, and then both Tuor and Voronwë saw that they were not far from the outer issue of the way of escape, and were once more in that deep dale of alders. Hence were all the bushes trampled, and the trees burnt, and the dale walls scarred with flame, and they wept, for they thought they knew the fate of those who sundered aforetime from them at the tunnel mouth. Now they journeyed down that river, but were again in fear from Melkor, and fought affrays with his orc bands, and were in peril from the wolf riders, but his fire drakes sought not at them. both for the great exhaustion of their fires in the taking of Gondolin, and the increasing power of Ulmo as the river grew. So came they after many days, for they went slowly, and got their sustenance very hardly, to those great heaths and morasses above the land of willows, and Voronway knew not those regions. Now here goes Sirion, a very great way under earth, diving at the great cavern of the tumultuous winds, but running clear again above the pools of twilight, even where Tulkas after fought with Melko's self. Tuor had fared over these regions by night and dusk after Ulmo came to him amid the reeds, and he remembered not the ways. In places that land is full of deceits and very marshy, and here the host had long delay and was vexed by sore flies, for it was autumn still, and agues and fevers fared amongst them, and they cursed Melko. Yet came they at last to the great pools and the edges of that most tender land of willows, and the very breaths of the winds thereof brought rest and peace to them, and for the comfort of that place the grief was assuaged of those who mourn the dead in that great fall. There women and maids grew fair again, and their sick were healed, and old wounds ceased to pain. Yet they alone, who of reason feared their folk living still in bitter thraldom in the hells of iron, sang not, nor did they smile. Here they abode very long indeed, and Arundel was a grown boy, ere the voice of Ulmo's conches drew the heart of Tuor, that his sea-longing returned with a thirst the deeper for years of stifling, and all that host arose at his bidding, and got them down Sirion to the sea. Now the folk that had passed into the Eagle's Cleft and saw the fall of Glorfindel had been nigh 800s, a large wayfaring. Yet was it a sad remnant of so fair and numerous a city. But they who arose from the grasses of the land of willows in years after and fared away to sea, when spring set Celendine in the meads, and they had held sad festival in memory of Glorfindel, these numbered but 300s, and a score of men, and man-children, and 200s, and 60 of women and maid-children. Now the number of women was few because of their hiding or being stowed by their kinsfolk in secret places in the city. There were they burned or slain, or taken and enthralled, and the rescue parties found them too seldom, and it is the greatest ruth to think of this, for the maids and women of the Gondothlim were as fair as the sun, and as lovely as the moon, and brighter than the stars. Glory dwelt in that city of Gondolin of the 7 names, and its ruin was the most dread of all the sacks of cities upon the face of the earth. Nor Babylon, nor Ninwi, nor the towers of Trui, nor all the many takings of Roum, that is the greatest among men, saw such terror as fell that day upon Ammon Gwareth in the kindred of the gnomes. And this is esteemed the worst work that Melko has yet thought of in the world. Yet now those exiles of Gondolin dwelt at the mouth of Sirion by the waves of the great sea. There they take the name of Lothlim, the people of the flower, for Gondothlim is a name too sore to their hearts. And fair among the Lothlim Arundel grows in the house of his father, and the great tale of Tuor is come to its waning. Then said Little Heart, son of Bronweg, alas for Gondolin.